We're good to go, Laura. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Katie. Hi, everybody. I'm Laura McKay. I'm the manager of the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program. And we are a network of state agencies and coastal localities that implement Virginia's coastal laws and policies. And oh gosh, and I just realized I lost my notes there. There we go. So we are funded by NOAA. You can see on the screen at the bottom, if we scroll, I don't know if we can scroll up a little, Katie. So NOAA is the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. You probably all know them. So they fund us under the Coastal Zone Management Act. And since about 2014, we've been funding Clean Virginia Waterways to help us develop and implement a Virginia marine debris reduction plan. And we've just updated that plan last November. So this is the cover you're seeing on the screen. And I put the link to it in the chat if you don't already have it. And I'm going to copy that and paste it again in case folks aren't seeing it there. Hopefully that's coming through. There we go. And so having just updated the plan, one of the things that we wanted to do in the near term was develop a survey on marine debris and people's attitudes about the words and the policies and what they think about it. So that's why we invited you here today to take a look at the results of this survey. It focuses mainly on plastic pollution and how concerned Virginians are about it, and how much, to what degree do they support various policies that could be adopted. Also want to let you know, we put some questions in there too about whether people, how comfortable they are with drinking tap water. And that relates, of course, to the number of, oh, here's the Virginia Conservation Network coming in too. Great. Yeah, you know, there's so many water bottles that we're finding on the beaches and everywhere. And so we're wondering if it's because of concerns about tap water. So you'll see some results about that as well. And the other thing is that we are hoping to receive another grant from the NOAA Marine Debris Program. We don't know yet if we'll get that, but we were looking at MARCO, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean, and its Marine Debris Work Group is looking at hopefully doing a project, a social marketing campaign on trying to reduce the number of plastic water bottles on beaches and other waterfront recreation areas. So hopefully we'll be able to move ahead with that with one funding source or another. So we're going to go through the results today, and then in mid-May, we're going to conduct some more in-depth one-on-one interviews that Steve Robbie will tell you more about, to better understand those reactions and the survey results that we did receive. So be thinking about questions that you might want us to add to those in-depth interviews that are coming up. And so with that, I just want to, I kind of already introduced Steve Robbie with OpinionWorks. Steve's been doing incredible work for us for several years now, and we appreciate that. But up first will be Katie Register, with Director of Clean Virginia Waterways, without whom I don't think this plan would ever have happened. So thank you, Katie, for all that you do, and I'll turn it right over to you.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I always stress that dealing with plastic pollution in Virginia is a huge collaborative effort. So, and many of you on this line helped us write and update the Virginia Marine Debris Reduction Plan. So thanks to everyone. So what we're about to share with you are they're not preliminary, but they are the results of a survey of over 900 Virginians. We are asking you, please do not share anything you're going to hear today. This is still, we're still working on the report. We're going to be doing a press release, and all of you will receive our report the day before we send out the press release. We anticipate this will be in mid-June. So we beg you, do not share some of these results, any of these results. Do not do screen captures. We'll definitely share with you as soon as that report is done. And we timed this whole survey so that it would be fresh information in spring. So hopefully it will be able to influence legislators and people looking at policy over the summer for the next general session. So we will, as Laura said, be asking your input for what questions should we ask when we do the in-depth interviews, which are starting next week, actually. These will be 45-minute interviews. So if you see something as Steve is talking that you think, oh, I'd like to know more about that, make sure you tell us so that we can add it to our interview script. So at this point, I'm going to introduce Steve. Steve is the principal with OpinionWorks, and he actually will share some of the many projects that he has worked on over the years for the environment. So I guess I've covered everything I needed to. So Steve, go ahead and share your screen and I'll stop sharing mine.
Thank you, Katie. You should be able to see my screen. Can you see the PowerPoint? Yes. Okay, good. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for your time this afternoon. We're really excited to share these results with you. And I'd like to say this is a fairly good sized group. So I will build into my presentation some pause points where we can have a little conversation. I'm sure that you will have some thoughts arise as you take a look at these results, maybe some questions about it, maybe some strategy thoughts or whatever. In addition, I'd encourage you to use the chat. And Katie, I'm sure you can help me monitor what's going on in the chat in case we need to respond to anything in the moment. Don't hesitate to populate that chat with immediate questions, and we'll try to deal with that as we go. So let me begin. I just want to start with a little credential because a lot of you don't know our firm, I'm sure. And so we're called OpinionWorks. We're based in Annapolis. I founded this firm in 2001, so it's been a while. And it was my goal to work on things that I personally believe in. So I do a lot of work in the Chesapeake Bay restoration movement and around marine debris, but also in public health and in higher ed. And so we've worked for some of the clients that you see on the screen. All of this is audience research. So we are, and political, the Baltimore Sun was and still is our client since 2007 when they do statewide polling, which since being purchased by a venture capitalist, they are not doing very much anymore. But when they do, we do their polling and look at elections. So we're accustomed to working throughout this region and elsewhere. And so I'm delighted to bring you these results. Let me tell you what we did here. It's a statewide sample of 901 interviews, as Katie mentioned. So that gives us a great ability to look within the overall data set, understand some segmentation, where there's opportunities, where there's some problems within the general population with regard to some of these behaviors and perceptions that we're about to see. It's representative. So we've looked at the composition of the Commonwealth's electorate. And so these are registered voters. We're taking a look at people that are across the state geographically. We've looked at gender and race and ethnicity and the age profile and the political makeup of the state. So all of that is reflected here. The sampling error is 3.3% plus or minus on this sample. It's mixed mode. And so what that means is, you despite my really good friends over at the Washington Post who just published a gigantic poll, national poll this weekend that some of you probably saw, they are still relying on phone only, which makes me crazy. You can't do that anymore. And there's such a huge non-response bias. So here and everywhere, we are doing multi-mode sampling. So there's online sampling in the mix. There's wireless and landline phone sampling in the mix, which together give us a very good sense of the electorate. So we don't miss people. I think the online method through consumer panels, which are big databases, enable us to get younger, more mobile voters, people of color, others that are new residents and all kinds of stuff. People who just don't answer their phone, like my 18-year-old son who wouldn't answer a phone to save his life, and I think that's probably true of everybody under a certain age, and a lot of older people that get spam phone calls. So anyway, I feel very confident of the representative nature of the sample. And it was fielded as you can see in March. So Katie mentioned, we're very sensitive to keeping it fresh. I'm not so sure that the issues that we're polling on in this case are that perishable that we can't release it here in this later, a little bit later in the spring, but we're cognizant of that and want to keep the data fresh and are grateful to you for keeping it under wraps, until we're ready to put it out there. Just quickly to give you a sense of what we came up with in terms of the distribution, here it is by age and race and ethnicity, and the political makeup of the state. We all know Virginia is a very purple state, and it swings a little bit, and so our sample is reflective of that. So let's take a look at context. So let's begin here. We position for voters some of the problems that are of concern environmentally, but also outside of the environmental realm so that we can contextualize people's concerns with some other problems. And here they are. There's a fairly good sized list, and this is a scale that I borrowed from a national pollster a few years ago, which allows us to benchmark against other things that are going on nationally. And it works really well. We ask people to rate things on a 4-part scale: a very serious problem, somewhat serious problem, not much of a problem, or not a problem at all. So on this chart, the red is very serious and the orange is somewhat serious. And we can combine those as the top two measure for this, and it allows us to stratify where these problems lie. So the first thing, of course, to note is the tremendous concern that voters have about inflation and the cost of living, which is we all know about it, and it's here only for benchmarking purposes so that you can kind of contextualize some of the economic and COVID related stuff that you see on the list up against our environmental issues. But inflation is a pulsating concern of voters right now, and it's a problem sign for the party that's perceived to be in power, for sure. I think we all know that, but it's a very big problem. So just beneath that, plastic floating in the ocean. I think that's observation number one, is the fact that floating plastic is the top concern other than inflation on this long list. It tops everything. It tops climate change. It tops good paying jobs. It tops habitat, chemicals in the environment. I mean, it is a very big concern. It's really been interesting to me in the last 2 or 3 years in focus groups on different topics. I work a lot on recycling, for example, and we were in LA doing a focus group a few months ago, and there was an older woman in this focus group who was quiet through much of the group, but towards the end, she says, I've really got to start recycling because of all that plastic floating out there in the ocean. It just worries me so much. It bothers me so much. And I've seen that over and over again, that people are thinking about the floating plastics, and you can see how big of a concern it is. So I think I've got to note that. And then just beneath that is plastics and toxins contaminating human food. Not quite as high a level of concern. I draw this line here because this is maybe a second tier, but very, very strong second tier of concerns. And just beneath, floating plastic. So plastic, there's a lot of concern about it out there. And then beneath that, chemicals and other toxins. And then you get to some other things that we all think about, like loss of habitat, climate change. I'll skip over jobs and COVID and go to pollution sources located close to where people live. An environmental justice issue, something that we all think a lot about. Unfortunately, on a broad societal scale, this is not at the top of the list, but it relates very much to one's personal perspective and how much you're aware of this problem. But here it is, 65% call it very or somewhat serious. And then severe weather, which is an interpretation perhaps of climate change, actually lower than climate change now. Used to be higher. And trash and litter in your community. So Katie looked at this list a day or two ago, and her observation, which I really appreciated, was look at the juxtaposition of plastic floating in the ocean at the top versus trash and litter in your community at the bottom. Now you could say there are a lot of people living in Virginia in communities where there isn't a lot of trash on the ground, and maybe that's just not something they worry about. But likewise, It's not as if they're living out in the ocean and there's plastic floating around them. It's really interesting and important for us to focus on the fact that the very serious number for floating plastic in the ocean is 55. And for trash and litter in your community, it's only 24. So while this is a concern of people, I think, we need to look up the list and see where the real driving and motivating concern is for people. So I want to offer the first pause point here and just see if anybody feels the need to jump in with either methodological questions about what we've done or this contextual slide that you see. If not, I'll just go on. Excuse me. Okay, let me move on. So let's talk a bit about tap water.
Hey, Steve.
Yeah, Laura, go ahead.
Sorry. I think one thing that when you and Katie and I were talking the other day that we thought was so interesting is that idea that while they don't think trash is a problem in their community, they see it's out there in the ocean, but where do they think it comes from? is kind of puzzling. And they don't make that connection that even a small amount of trash in their community accumulates into a large amount out in the ocean.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And so Katie mentioned the in-depth interviews we're about to conduct, and the way those are done is one-on-one Zoom sessions, a virtual session with an individual voter who's been selected by us from the voter sample. And so the kind of paradox, or whatever you might call it, that Laura just talked about is just exactly the type of thing that is fodder for those qualitative discussions. When you get a voter in an environment like that, where they can just talk in depth and kind of talk about their thinking and kind of help us understand where they're coming from, that's a wonderful thing to position. That's an example of the kind of thing that you can learn a great deal about when you get them into that kind of a setting. Is anything else striking anybody right now before we move on? Okay, so let's look at tap water for a minute. So we measured people's attitudes about tap water in 3 ways, or around 3 dimensions. The first is whether they consider it to be clean and healthy. The second is its taste. And the third is the quality of the pipes, the condition of the pipes coming to your home. So at the bottom of every slide, by the way, you're going to be able to see the question wording as we asked it. So here, we've asked them to do a rating, to rate tap water on an A to F scale, as if in school. And so you can see where we are. A's and B's for clean and healthy is 25 and 33, totaling up to 58%. Taste is similar, although there's some concern around taste that's not insignificant, 17% rounded. It doesn't appear to add correctly because of rounding, but 17% give it a D or an F, the taste of their water. And then pipes, a lot of people don't know, but there's a range of happiness to concern around pipes. You can imagine that these measures correlate relatively strongly with where one lives, what kind of a neighborhood, what kind of outlook one has in life, et cetera. Are they drinking it? So are they drinking the tap water? Now, this is a you could check all that apply type question, so it adds to more than 100%. But we have only 37% of the Commonwealth's residents who are drinking their tap water unfiltered. The rest are doing something else. So 47% are drinking it filtered. It appears that some people, when you net these, it's 77. So there's a few people that are maybe drinking it straight up sometimes and filtered sometimes. But about half of the residents of the state, or at least the voters, are filtering their water before drinking it. Excuse me. 11% say I'm not drinking it at all. And 23% are drinking some or a lot of bottled water instead of drinking tap water. So you can see the range. There's a lot of workarounds. I mean, I've worked in several projects lately where sponsors have had a driving hypothesis that tap water concern is so motivating to people that they're willing to get involved with environmental protection as a result. And the real world is that, yes, that's kind of true, but really people have just figured workarounds. If they have tap water, concerns, they're doing something else instead, filtering or drinking bottled. And so unfortunately, tap water, though important to everybody, is not the thing that's kind of usually leading to lots of environmental action. How about drinking bottled water? So how often are people doing it? In Virginia, 39% often, 32% sometimes. Now, this is a subjective measure. We're not asking them the number of bottles per week or something like that, but it's a frequency scale, often, sometimes, seldom, never. So it's subjective. We don't know what often means to one person versus another, but it gives you a sense that there are, almost 3/4 of the residents who are, pretty frequently on a regular basis drinking bottled water. And then you've got about 1/4 plus that are seldom or never doing so. How does that compare over time? Is there a trend? Regrettably, so you can see that 38% have increased their bottled water drinking compared to a few years ago. 19% have decreased it. Now, I do enough public health work, we're asking people on the public health side to drink bottled water instead of things like Gatorade and soda. So some of this behavior can be switching out of more negative things for their health. We don't know, it's possible. And certainly some people are choosing bottled water because they think it is healthier than their tap. Nonetheless, from a disposable bottle standpoint, of course, we've got a problem here where the trend line is 2-to-1 increased over decreased. So it's something for us to know about. So before I go to the next, let me pause again and see if the tap water section is calling anything up for anybody. Okay, let's go on. Word testing. We did a little, we dipped in, but this is another area where the qualitative interviews are going to do a lot for us in terms of giving us much more depth and being able to understand how people are perceiving these words. So we asked this, an open-ended question. What do you think of when you hear the term marine debris? So there's a couple things to say here. These are categorized responses based on a raw response that people gave us in a phrase or a word or a sentence or whatever. So the leading idea is that a lot of people get it, garbage, trash, debris, litter, whatever, floating in the water. I mean, that basic idea is mentioned by 40%, 39 of the people that we interviewed. 11% said something specifically about plastic. So in one sense, you can add them to the 39, and that brings you to 50 who get that there's floating stuff in the water, in this case, specifically plastic. And the reason we broke this out specifically is because of the frequency with which plastic was mentioned up against any other, material that you could think of. So plastics were mentioned 11% of the time in connection to floating, being in the ocean, being in the water. And sometimes bags were mentioned, plastic bags, sometimes plastic bottles were mentioned. 11% of the people jumped over the definition of marine debris and went right to how they were feeling about it. And it was always sad or upset or angry or something. Negative emotions around marine debris. So I'm presuming, we don't know, but we assume that people who said sad are thinking about the output. They're thinking about what marine debris is and maybe have an understanding of it. And it's driving them to a negative emotion. And then another 8% specifically mentioned marine life. So they were talking about turtles, sea turtles, or they were talking about other aquatic life or terrestrial birds. They were talking about those 6-pack ring holders that everybody knows, everybody's seen the images of those tangled up in wildlife. And so people talked about all that kind of stuff. And so again, I'm presuming that 8% who went right to marine life are kind of on that leading edge of understanding and motivation. And then there were other more general answers like pollution or polluted water or water in the ocean or it's dirty or whatever. But two other specifics to call out. One is the boating industry or fishing industry. So cruise boats, motorboaters, whoever's in a boat, fishing nets, fishing equipment, dumping from boats, all of that specificity around boating or industry was mentioned by 4%. And then the garbage patch, quote unquote, or a floating island, an island of plastic the size of Texas, you know, all that kind of stuff, amounted to 1%. So you could probably add that to the 11 up here if you'd like, or up here to this, but a very specific image around a floating island was mentioned. There were 11% who didn't have any idea, and there were 5% who mentioned something else. Oftentimes, things like the military, the Marines are out there picking up litter on the beaches, you know, that kind of stuff. So there were misunderstandings. War, people actually said war. And so the word Marine was misunderstood by a chunk, you know, of people. By and large, I would say it was understood by most. However, the second question in this section was about motivational impact. So we decided on 6 possibilities and measured them just in a list. It was a randomized list, and asked people to check off up to 2 that seemed like a bigger problem, you know, a big problem, bigger problem to you. And you can see what rises to the top. Once again, the concept of plastic really jumps to the top of the list. And plastic ocean pollution was checked off 48% of the time out of the 6 possibilities. Plastic pollution, 35% of the time. Marine debris is way down here next to marine litter towards the bottom of this particular list. Now, this is not definitive, and I'm not suggesting that marine debris programs suddenly start calling themselves, you know, plastic ocean pollution programs or something like that. That's not at all the recommendation, but it's a clue that when we're communicating with the public, that there are more evocative terms than marine debris. And you can bet, and we'll test this in these qualitative interviews that are just upcoming, that if marine debris, which is down here in terms of its impact, calls up some of those images that I just talked about on the prior slide, that my hypothesis going into the qualitative is that these terms higher on the list are probably going to do an even better job of that, and maybe more urgently. We'll see. You know, we'll see how people react. Now, you all may have other words that you'd like to test, and so this is a perfect example of something to either mention now or throw in the chat or email to us after this discussion. But we do want to do a pretty good language test. So Joan asks in the chat, do we know how much of a disconnect is between perception, okay, on tap water, perception and actual quality of tap water? I don't feel qualified to answer that question. I can say that there is a correlation with urban areas and lower socioeconomics, and people that are thinking about pipes coming into their home tend to be people living in older housing and that sort of stuff. But I don't know, maybe others on the call do know that. And Sarah says ocean trash is one term we tend to use. Okay, good. Yeah, we can add that, Sarah, to the list when we test things. So who else has any thoughts about this that you want to express? All right, let me move on. Public policy, are you ready? So we tested several, 8 or 9 different public policy proposals, possibilities that the Virginia General Assembly could take up. And so I want to share these with you. And these are all addressed on this scale that you see. It's a sequence of questions that were randomized, all using the same scale. Strongly favor, somewhat favor, neutral or not sure, somewhat oppose, strongly oppose. So obviously the color scale that we've got here corresponds. So the dark green is the strongly, and it comes around to the strongly oppose. So we've called out the total of the strongly favor and the somewhat favor and done the same on the opposed side. So I'm just going to roll through these. I've also got the partisanship on the right. Now, in Virginia, as you probably all know, you don't register with a party, you declare it when you go vote. So it's a little different than some places like Maryland, where we have partisan registration. So we rely on people to say what they are. And so these are self-described Democrats, self-described Republicans, and self-described unaffiliated or independent or third-party people. And so we're going to look at their breakouts on each slide as well so that we have a sense. So we have the favor and the opposed number for Democrats, which is stronger. So this is a ban on single-use plastic bags. You're going to be able to see at the bottom of every slide what the proposal is and how people react. So it's 3-1. Obviously, the plastics industry doesn't like this. And if this were proposed, as we've seen so many times in so many places, they would gin up a big campaign in opposition and would make it very difficult to pass this bill, even though there's a 3-1 support. I'm intrigued by the 5-cent fee question, which has much lower support, which is a little surprising given that DC's got a successful one. There's others in the DC suburbs that are working really well. But people are just annoyed, by the 5-cent fee. Now we've found, I've worked for the DC Department of the Environment, and we have looked at the outcome of the bag fee after it was passed and implemented, which is now over 10 years ago, and how people have received it and responded to it. And people don't dislike it. And part of the reason is because there was a very clear assertion on the part of the District of Columbia about where the money that was raised was going to go. And you've probably all seen the Skip the Bag, Save the River campaign that they instituted, very successful in terms of giving people a sense of purpose around this 5-cent fee. So one thing to note about this question is that this is an abstract 5-cent fee without any connection to any purpose for the fee or any more details about how it's collected or whatever. But it's notable that it's much lower. It's only a plurality. It's 48-32 versus 61-21 we saw for an outright ban. The other thing that happens is that among Republicans who on the ban, surprisingly perhaps, favor it by a plurality, the support just craters when you look at a 5-cent fee among Republicans. It goes to a -12. So that's very important. Although Democrats support this 5-cent fee 3-1, and independents narrowly support it by a 17-point plurality, Republicans are, -12 on it. So there's a big swing that occurs there. And by the way, I'm going to give you time to talk about this, of course, all of these, but let me show them to you as a group. Jim says they view it as a tax, which I think is probably right on, I'm sure. What about straws? And again, this is probably not the thing that we want to see, but 47% favor, 28% oppose. So much lower. I'll go back to the bag ban, 61-21, the straw ban, 47-28. Don't we love our straws, And so are people thinking about, gee, I could have a paper straw instead that would be just as effective? No, probably not. So there's a lot of public education that could be done here. But again, you lose Republicans, you basically lose independents on this. Not literally, but it's a narrow plurality and it's well below 50%. So a straw ban right now is not very popular. What about polystyrene? This is a very different picture. So ban polystyrene or foam takeout containers, supported across the board. Republicans 54-22, Democrats 74-8, Independents 64-14. There is no love for polystyrene out there. This is surprisingly large. So, maybe this could be an attainable goal. What about this? You saw what happened on the 5-cent bag fee, but on a bottle deposit, 5-cent or 10-cent fee on bottled drinks that you get back when you return the bottles to a store. So maybe that's the key right there, that you get back. It might be those 4 words that are defining the difference, but it's an enormous difference in how the 5-cent bag fee and the bottle deposit are being received by voters across Virginia. So here we've got a 65-17% verdict. I mean, if I were writing about this in a polling memo, I would call it resounding or overwhelming. I mean, it's a very strong level of support, and almost 4 out of 10 strongly favor this idea. And again, across partisan lines. So really important to know. And you all know this. I mean, you can imagine a bottle bill being introduced, how the bottling industry would get all crazy about it, up in arms. So they would blunt these numbers. There would be a pitched campaign. It would be difficult. But right now, starting off, you've got very strong support for it. 50 cent per cigarette pack litter fee. Katie has educated me. This is what, litter abatement fee? Is that what this is called, Katie? I believe.
Yeah, that's what it's called in San Francisco, where it's $1.05 per every pack you buy. And they call it a cigarette litter abatement fee. And all the funds go to litter abatement. Yep.
Yeah. So being implemented there. Here in Virginia, very favorable. In fact, 44% strongly favor this idea. This is so interesting. So you've got a 64% favor number, almost 2/3 of voters overall. Again, it crosses party lines very strongly. Only 1 in 5 oppose it overall. You know, in part, things that happen with cigarettes and other things like alcohol that we've looked at over the years, alcohol taxes are kind of like this too, where there's just a large share of the public that does not feel they would even be impacted by this. And so it's quite easy to gain political support for something like this. Now, whether it's ultimately successful in the political climate we're in, and particularly in Virginia with its heritage of being close to the tobacco industry, you know, who knows? But right now, you're starting out in a very favorable place. And I think people probably like the idea of having industry help pay for this. And actually, industry is not, of course, it's the consumers, but, you know, having there be some help around payment for this. Big finish, 2 more, I think, slides to go in this section, but wow, what about requiring manufacturers to use less plastic in product packaging? I mean, what happened to all the free market Republicans who, you know, want you to support industry? And this is a requirement on manufacturers to use less plastic. I mean, it's amazing. So you have 45% strongly favoring this across the state, 3/4 of voters in favor in general, and big time, you know, it doesn't crack 10% opposition across any flavor of partisan. And, you know, over here you see the overall opposition. The strong opposition is only 4% of the electorate. So not a big opposition. Again, you know what industry would do. And so these numbers would shift some. This would get eaten up and, you know, this would get eaten into, but you're starting off with an extremely strong support profile on this. And then the manufacturers helping pay for local recycling programs, reducing burden on taxpayers is a key phrase in here. But again, very popular, 71% in favor, 12% opposed, 40% strongly in favor, and 31% somewhat in favor of this. So before we get to trusted messengers, I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that you guys want to talk about with this. So I would invite you to go ahead if anybody wants to discuss anything. And I see there's some stuff happening in the chat as well.
Yeah, go ahead and turn off or turn your microphone on if you had a question for Steve on this very interesting policy support section. Well, I'll go ahead, Steve, with one thing that you mentioned, the sense of purpose about a potential fee on bags. I know in one county in Virginia that was considering a 5-cent fee on plastic bags. I read a couple letters to the editor, which were not in support of the 5-cent fee, and they all focused on, you know, more greedy politicians trying to take more money from us. I think none of them had the understanding that all that money is supposed to go back to the community to deal with litter cleanups and providing reusable bags. So I thought that was a really good sense of purpose about the fee is obviously very important to convey.
Yeah, super important. I mean, we had a little case study in this right here in the Washington Metro where DC enacted its fee and then Montgomery, whenever it did it a year or so later, put in their 5-cent bag fee. And so DC did the Skip the Bag, Save the River campaign. And when we had focus groups around that, and it was shortly after the fee had been introduced, people, just average people out there in the city were able to say, skip the bag, save the river. I mean, it was crazy how effective that was. And of course, DC was giving out free reusable bags with the slogan on it. They were just doing a lot of good stuff to reinforce. Whereas Montgomery County, who are my friends, but they did not inject the same sense of purpose into their campaign at all. And the polling numbers in Montgomery were tough. And the council considered repeal. There were there was a big backlash. And it's not just because Montgomery's a different jurisdiction. It's got different dynamics politically, but as they go, it's a suburban jurisdiction with a very strong social contract and faith in government and that sort of stuff. And people wanted to repeal that. And I think it has everything to do with injecting a sense of purpose into the campaign. And that should be done from the get-go. If you're introducing a bill, the bill needs to include the dedicated source, where the funding is going to go, and that needs to be articulated strongly throughout the effort. And in your case, when you see the numbers we're getting back about floating plastic pollution, wouldn't you want to dedicate it there to helping with alleviating that problem? I think that would be even more effective, potentially, than dedicating it to local litter campaigns, but not my call. But I think you can see in these numbers how effective that could be.
And Steve, one of the comments says, I think the strong favor for requiring less plastic could be linked to the general public not having to change their behavior. Let industry make the change.
Sure.
Do you see that in some of the other work you've done, that people support things that don't require them to do anything personally?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, so we're all humans, aren't we? Yes, of course. If you can get somebody else to do it and takes the decision out of your hand. We have invested some energy for other clients in looking at packaging as a factor in people's buying decisions. So you're standing there in the grocery store, you're looking at two products, and one is packaged this way and one's packaged that way. And people say that the product packaging is going to be a factor for them, but it's not. Very, very seldom do people actually make purchase decisions on that basis. And so I think you're right, Katie. I think consumers want this to happen, but don't want to be responsible for it. It's too hard. And so if we can get the producers to reduce packaging, force them in some way, very attractive to people, you bet.
And then there's another comment from Jim. And Jim, I'm not really sure what you're asking. You say, were there any questions about the sources of plastic? Grocery stores, bottled beverage, carry out. Are you thinking that we should ask people where they think all the litter is coming from, or all the trash in the ocean?
Yeah, that was just my question. If what's people's perception of where it all comes from?
Yeah, and we didn't do that here, but I think that's an excellent thing to do in those qualitative interviews, is to explore a little bit of that, plus the issue that Laura was talking about earlier. So yes, that's perfect material for those interviews. I saw a hand waving. Fred.
Yeah, just real quick, I can't sit on my hand any longer. This is so interesting. The very first slide actually, with ocean debris, the connection with plastic in the ocean as opposed to in our homes. So I've just got to tell everybody, I think everybody's heard about our whale sculpture that we use for education here in the Valley. Several years ago, when we started this campaign against plastic here, we immediately realized that, it's pretty clean. I don't know, for any of you who've driven through the Shenandoah Valley, you've probably noticed it's pretty clean. There's a lot of cleanup efforts that go on here all the time, and it just doesn't have the same feel as some other urban areas in Virginia. One thing we are surrounded by everywhere that you look is water, and all of the water goes to the Chesapeake Bay. So we started our campaign, and I'm not trying to claim, a science about all this, but we started our campaign years ago linking immediately, if you throw that plastic down, it's going to make its way to the bay, whether you like it or not, and it's going to be in the ocean. And we've linked that from the very beginning, because it didn't work to talk about garbage laying around in the valley, because we don't have a lot of garbage laying around the valley. So we did take that route several years ago, and we've stuck to that. And it's just amazing to see these results, because it kind of makes me, feel like, well, we chose the right route. It's working.
It seems like you're in tune with what people are thinking about, for sure. Yeah. Okay. Pat asks if there were questions posed about what Virginia localities, et cetera, expend to support litter cleanup. Not in the survey, but we could do some version of that in these qualitative. Yeah, the connection, Connor mentions, I'm curious about the connection between if people think they're directly hurting animals, sea life, and willing to make a change. Absolutely. I mean, Katie and Laura and I have been involved in an effort around balloon releases. And we hit on the idea that if you present people who actively go out with family members and release balloons more than once a year, so we recruited these people into these qualitative interviews, and the impact of showing them wildlife that is tangled in balloons or ingesting balloons. And there was a necropsy photo of a sea turtle, which was really difficult to look at. And people just, you know, the impact of understanding that your action is causing that kind of a terrible outcome that you do not intend, because most people don't want to do that, was overwhelming. And it caused a change in people's thinking right on the spot. So I don't know whether we can create that kind of a powerful reaction around, you know, litter or not, but maybe, and it's something to explore. Let me go on and just show you the rest, because I don't want to run out of time, and we can keep these conversations going. Let me just have you look at trusted messengers. And so we tested a number of different players, not just these, but these were the top tier, the ones that performed the strongest. And you can see what we asked people. How much would you trust information about plastic pollution that comes from each of these sources? And then the scale was trusted a lot, some only a little, not at all. So I'm showing you the top 2 points. I mean, they're very similar is one way to think about this, the ones that we're showing you. But another thing for us to focus on is how the public sector is a very important partner in all this. You know, the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, recently renamed, is a very trusted source. VIMS, very trusted source. DEQ, trusted source. And it's often in DCR, you know, it's often surprising to people who work for these agencies to see the level of trust that the public actually has in their agency. But it is true in the connection with technical information like this, that an agency like DEQ, which may not feel like it's very popular with the public, you know, but I mean, there's trust in the expertise. And so being linked to some of these public agencies is an important thing to do with, you know, whatever you're planning, you know, whatever campaign. But the aquarium is very, very high. You know, the Virginia Aquarium is up here at the top of the list, a very respected institution. Nature Conservancy, also very favorable, Chesapeake Bay Foundation. So you have nonprofit partners who can also obviously play a leading role in all of this. The only reason that I'm not putting Clean Virginia Waterways and Virginia CZM on this list, who are sponsors, is because they weren't as well known. But had good profiles. It's just that they weren't as well known to the public as some of these others. And then finally, I just want to dip into behavior change for a second and show you a couple things that we asked about here. Littering behavior, which is relevant, and whether there are behavior change efforts that come out of this, or whether it's mainly a public policy focus, I don't know. But you know, there are some things to think about with regard to behavior. So do people toss litter on a scale of often, sometimes, seldom, never? I mean, there is some social desirability bias built into this topic where it's maybe hard for some people to admit that they do something like this, except that particularly with the online element to the sampling, which is much more anonymous than even a voice over the telephone that you don't know, but it's still a voice. People are much more truthful in that anonymity. And we do get a reading on some littering that is going on. And I can tell you it's true. And people in certain peer groups where it's common are happy to admit that they do it, which seems strange, but it's true. On the other side is, you know, would people pick it up when they see it? Often, sometimes, seldom, never. So this is an ethic that I personally believe, having done a lot of litter work, that we want to continue to try to build in the public. Pick it up when you see it. I mean, if that is happening, that the phenomenon is that people that actively litter, the people that are over here, walk into neighborhoods where there isn't anything on the ground and they're like, oh, people care about this neighborhood, so I'm going to put it in my pocket for a while. I mean, it's actually a phenomenon. And so there's a tipping point in neighborhoods that you have to try to reach where litter doesn't go on the ground. How do people feel when they see litter? And of course, most people are expressing things like that. And then finally, around behavior change, this isn't a very pretty slide. I didn't have time this morning to make this more beautiful, but just looking at using a refillable water bottle instead, picking up litter, using reusable bags, stop using plastic straws. So again, there's an over-reporting that's going on here. People aren't really going to change behavior in these kinds of numbers when it comes down. But this is a measure of intention and willingness. And you can see that it's high for 3 of these 5 behaviors. Refillable water bottles, picking up litter, using reusable bags, it's less high, though still good, for stop using straws and stop using all single, that's a hard one, right? Stop using all single-use plastic items for a month. So those are lower, and that correlates with what you saw earlier in the survey. But we've got, some potential for some real behavior change around some of those. So that's it for the findings. There's a lot of segmented data behind this that I'm happy to share and talk about when the time comes. But again, let me pause and hand it back to Katie and Laura and see if there's time for any further comments.
Yeah, I'd love to open it up and see if anyone has some overall thoughts, reactions. Are you surprised? Are you not surprised by what you saw? And any suggestions for our in-depth interviews, which will start next week. Okay, I don't see anyone turning on their microphone, but yeah, just to recap that we are going to be doing a short report. It's going to be about 8 pages. That's what's going to go out with the press releases in mid-June. And then a more thorough report. I don't know how many pages it will be, Steve, 30 pages, something like that, with all the details for the few of us who want to read a 30-page report. But hopefully the 8-page will cover the highlights. And we're hoping that that's the document that can be shared extensively with policymakers and legislators. And I see there are a few more things popping in the chat.
Yeah, so Pat's asking if the report will include policy recommendations for Virginia. I mean, I think we're happy to do that. I also, though, believe, I think we can identify the opportunities, and it's up to all of you who know the political environment to decide what you think is possible.
Yeah, I think that's right, Steve. We do want to be careful about making policy recommendations out of a state agency. We kind of have to wait for things to flow through the secretary, from the agency heads to the secretaries to the governor's office. But I think, just showing these results makes it pretty clear which policy options might have a very good chance of passage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Jim is struck by the difference between survey results and the behavior of legislators and people giving testimony at hearings. That's classic, right? I mean, when you take an actual sounding of the public, you get one thing, but the people that come out, they're recruited, they have especially strong feelings, they make it sound like the world's about to end. And legislators, of course, are hearing from the lobbyists for industry and others. So that totally explains it. And it's classic, and it happens over and over and over again. And so you have to break through that. And one of the ways to break through it is with something like this. I mean, if you have a credible statewide sampling that people can feel good about, they think it was done well, and the sponsors are credible, which is all true in this case, it can change the conversation. So don't be afraid, when the time comes and Katie's ready to release this, to use it, because this is where the public really is, not what you hear in public hearings.
Yeah. Boy, that really has come out in the news lately too, with the Roe v. Wade decision from the Supreme Court that was leaked, where it looks like they're going to strike it down, and yet polling of the public say a huge percentage do not want it struck down.
Right.
But it's politics is funny that way. And I heard something recently too on NPR that was so interesting about the way we get our news now, and with all the social media, that what's happened is we've given a huge voice to a small number of people. And so that's
12.
really, yeah, that's really affecting politicians, what they hear in social media versus from polls of everyone.
Right.
I noticed Joan added something to the chat, very interesting. Our in-depth interviews could explore how communications can counter corporate campaigns. And I think that would be great. We could use some help, perhaps shaping those questions more. But one of the questions that comes to mind from your comment, Joan, is EPR. A lot of people I've heard say that extended producer responsibility, EPR, is not a public friendly phrase. It's not understandable. Have any of you an alternative phrase? I mean, and we did avoid using EPR in our poll. Instead we said manufacturers more responsible for the cost of recycling to get it off the taxpayer. I mean, do any of you know better phrases that we could perhaps test? And if you can't think of one now, you can definitely email us.
Well, and Katie, I think that's a good example of something we can ask the voters in these interviews to do. I mean, oftentimes we have to ask them to help us. What kind of language would you use if you were talking about this? Like, what would you call it? And sometimes an average person out there, comes up with something that's really good. That's like, yeah, of course, that makes sense, because it's everyday language and it's intuitive and strikes people. So if we want to do that with these interviews, it certainly fits with the word test we're going to do. We could do that.
Okay, great. Yeah. And then Pat mentions intrigued to see what the public believes Executive Order 17 will and will not do. And that is, of course, the new executive order from our current governor, which rescinds the previous order that was to decrease the use of single-use plastics in agencies and college universities. And the new order focuses much more on post-consumer recycling, shifting that burden. Instead of turning off the faucet of use, it's like, oh, let's just recycle more on the tail end. I guess we could ask that. I'm not sure how many voters have heard of Order EO 17, but we could phrase those questions. Do you think it's better to decrease the use of these things as opposed to put more money into recycling infrastructure? Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, recycling, I say unfortunately in this context, is viewed as such a high level public good by almost everybody in society. It's a very cross-cutting social good issue that what the governor has done with that effort is hit on, he's completely in tune with where the public is. It's not to say that you couldn't, reducing use, particularly when that's considered burdensome, is very unpopular still, and it's still on the leading edge. This doesn't mean we can't explore it, but unfortunately, I think he's probably right in the groove with where the public is on recycling and where the emphasis should be today. It would be a heavy lift to get the public to believe that it's better to try to get everybody to stop using stuff than to just recycle it, because after all, recycling is the way we help the earth, so that's where we are. We're 20 years from that. We're 10 years from where we should be on all that, sadly.
Do you think it would be good to test the message that recycling is not working? We've done it, we've tried it for 40 years and it's failing, or is that
that's a terrible thicket. That feels like cannibalism to me. I mean, maybe, but I would hate to undercut trust in our recycling systems, but we could look at that. I mean, if we feel like we need to do that.
Well, it is, when you think about the amount of waste that is recycled, and you compare that to charts of the ever increasing amounts of plastic in the ocean, there's clearly a problem. So I don't know if even just juxtaposing those two charts in any way helps elicit some ideas of what should be done. It's probably too complicated for an interview question, but that's the reality though, right? Recycling is a relatively small amount of plastic is recycled. Huge amounts are continuing to accumulate and are projected to accumulate even more in the future in the ocean.
Right.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. Better way to.
I think the public thinks that if there's a recycling code on the bottom of their plastic, then it is recycled. I mean, there's that huge disconnect about what's actually possible. But I hear you, Steve, that we don't want to undermine the one thing people think they're doing. But as I once heard a speaker say, it's the least we can do is recycling. And he said, I mean it like it's the least. It's the very, very least that we can do. So.
We ought to be doing a lot more.
Yeah.
All right, we've got a few more possible phrases to use instead of extended producer responsibility. And Jen asked, maybe we should ask how much of your recycling is actually recycled. Mm-hmm. And do they know? Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, great. I know it's just a little bit after 3. Again, we're going to start these one-on-one interviews, next Monday or Tuesday, something like that. So if you have some specific questions you'd like us to consider, please email. You can email me and I'll share them with Laura and Steve. And here's a nice long one. A comment. I think it'd be interesting to delve into the response about requiring manufacturers to use less plastic in production or in packaging. Perhaps it's due to not having to make a decision or change their own behavior and select products that use less plastic. I'm curious whether people are concerned about the impacts on the manufacturing end of producing plastics.
Virginia, you're asking, is our public more informed or aware than we realize? The answer is no. Sadly, that's rarely the answer.
Wishful thinking, just wishful thinking.
Yeah, right.
I'm just really amazed at the response about plastic pollution. The first question is about, the juxtaposition of the term plastic pollution versus litter or marine debris. To me, that gives a sense that people are paying attention and listening. So, I don't know.
Yeah, there are certain things that crack the public consciousness in a way that is unique. One of those, at least here in Maryland, is bacteria at community beaches. Anytime there's a outbreak of bacteria anywhere in Maryland at a community beach, like everybody seems to know it immediately, and it comes up, but there's a lot of other stuff that people pay zero attention to. And it does appear that the plastic floating out in the ocean is just something that has captured the public's mind. It really has. And that's a fascinating thing to think about, to figure out how did that happen. I'm sure a lot's been written about that, but just understanding how that's formed in the public's consciousness and why people are so obsessed with it. But regardless of how it came to be, it's now something that we can leverage, and I think we should. I mean, it's important, and people are worried about it. And there are connections now being formed towards food supply, and what that means for what we're all eating. And so that's going to kind of take it up to a different level when the public figures out those connections. So we're on a really interesting journey around all this. But I think from the point of view of these legislative proposals and other things you're all talking about, you have a very powerful motivator there that you should figure out how to harness.
And Steve, at this point too, I think because some people joined late, we should remind them again that please don't share these results yet with any legislators or policymakers. We really want to get this into a good, solid report before it's released. So if you did join late, please if you took any snips, don't share them with anyone. Keep them to yourself for now. And as soon as we release the report, then it'll be fair game.
Yeah, and I'll thank you for that reminder. And I'll also remind people that this whole survey was one of the products of the Virginia Marine Debris Reduction Plan. We had a list of 10 high priorities, and this was one of the top priorities as we start to implement that 5-year plan. So I just put in the chat box a link to the Coastal Zone Management Program's webpage where you can download a copy of the Virginia Marine Debris Reduction Plan and look at what else is in that plan. But certainly legislation and policy are an important part of the preventing this huge problem of marine debris and ocean plastic pollution, as I guess we'll start to call it.
Keep getting that phrase out there.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, I just want to give my thanks again so much to both Katie and Steve for all the work you do for the CZM program. And I know Noah appreciates it too, who funds all this ultimately. So thank you so much. And I think this is going to be great to see this report come out. And hopefully all of you that have joined today will be able to use it in your work and spread the word and use these results in ways to help improve our ocean and our environment. So I think with that, are we ready to all say goodbye?
I think so. We'll leave the chat open for another minute. I'm going to stop recording, but thank you all for being here today. And you'll hear from us in mid-June with the report and press release.
Bye, everybody.